It's a pleasure to be here to participate in the observations of the centenary of this great house. At first brush, one might be moved to ask, what is this house doing in colonial revival Bennington? Where did it come from? In the context of its times, though, it does prove to have company and an interesting pedigree. When Washington, D.C. resident Edward Everett built his great country house wrapping the eastern slope of Mount Anthony, he was following a well-established pattern among the super-rich of the East Coast. Perhaps the most famous among the tastemakers were the Vanderbilt family, drawing upon their vast railroading wealth. They hired Richard Morris Hunt to make their architectural mark. And Hunt was the first American to train at the Ecole des Beaux Arts in Paris, then the most famous school of architecture in the world, and destined to be the model for architectural education in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Because it taught the study of the best examples from the past, it's often considered a font of empty historic eclecticism. But it was more than that, because the Ecole des Beaux Arts also taught very careful functional planning embodied in grand formal designs. Its forms are often classical, but it could draw creatively upon almost any historic style. Its best products were hardly copies of the past, but rather inventive compositions in an established vocabulary. Well, on his return from Paris, Hunt set himself up as the arbiter of good taste for New York's emergent millionaires, dishing up historic eclecticism in grand style to give status to and confer pedigree on the city's new wealth. He made a major mark on society with his 1882 W.K. Vanderbilt mansion on Fifth Avenue, borrowing from Loire Chateau. And then he followed it up with a string of urban mansions and country estates for the Vanderbilts and their peers. This was an architecturally productive generation. The Vanderbilts alone built at least 10 great estates, all by major national architects and landscapers. In Rhode Island, including on the top left, Newport's Marble House of 1882 to 88 to 92, modeled on the Petit Trianon at Versailles. And the Breakers, upper right, 1892 to 95, emulating a Genoese Baroque villa. In the Hudson Valley, their homes included Hyde Park, lower left, of 1896 to 99, and in the Berkshires, Elm Court in Lenox from 1887. But they also built on Long Island in New Jersey, in Vermont, and North Carolina. Two of these estates were particularly notable as ambitious working landscapes with model agricultural operations. Lila Vanderbilt and her husband W. Seward Webb built Shelburne Farms here in Vermont between 1886 and 1902. We see that, images of it on the top two images. Utilizing the talents of Robert H. Robertson, who was the architect to the Vanderbilt's New York Central Railroad, and landscape designer Frederick Law Olmsted. Their house ended up vaguely Tudor in style, but only after they had considered and discarded creating a replica of Warwick Castle and a classical columnar version that looked like a gigantic model of the White House. Here they carried out extensive reforestation on their land and launched model horse breeding, sheep, and dairy operations. Lila's brother, George Washington Vanderbilt, utilized Olmsted and Richard Morris Hunt to create Biltmore, the two images at the bottom of the screen, America's largest house outside of Asheville, North Carolina, between 1889 and 1895. And this included a staircase modeled directly on the great external staircase of the chateau at Blois, and it was surrounded by formal gardens, huge working forest preserves, and its own important dairy operation. Everett's estate, with its mansion, formal gardens, and extensive fruit orchards, was very much in this working landscape spirit of Shelburne and Biltmore. But in this, it tapped into what also had been an established Vermont tradition, significantly more widespread than the single instance of Shelburne Farms. Wealthy Vermont native sons had been returning since just after the Civil War, with fortunes earned elsewhere, to build working country estates, taking advantage of depressed land values to assemble large tracts, but also seeking to use the examples of their operations to improve and advance the agricultural economy of the state. Among the most notable were the Park family of North Bennington. Trenor Park developed a huge land holding around the core of his father-in-law's farm between 1864 and 1865, and employed New York and Troy architect Henry Dudley to build a grand French Second Empire house. His daughter Eliza and her husband John G. McCullough assumed ownership of the house and updated its interiors in 1891, and thus it largely survives today, open to the public as the splendid Park McCullough mansion that we see at the top of the screen. Another daughter, Lila, and her husband Frederick Jennings developed a parallel estate on park land, using the prestigious firm of Renwick, Aspinwall, and Owen to build their country house, Fairview, in 1903. Their estate ultimately forming the campus of Bennington College. In Woodstock, Frederick Billings began developing his estate with the purchase and expansion of George Perkins Marsh's farm in 1869. His grand house, which we see at the top left, went through several iterations in response to the designs of the fashionable William Ralph Emerson and then Henry Hudson Holly, and with landscaping by Robert Morris Copeland and others. Beyond creating a great residence, though, Billings also sought to continue the work of Marsh by reestablishing a productive relationship between man and his landscape, carrying out the reforestation of Mount Tom and developing a model dairy operation. The result today is, of course, the Marsh-Billings Rockefeller National Park and the Billings Farm Museum. In the Northeast Kingdom, Vermonter and New York hotelier Elmer Darling began to assemble his vast Mountain View farm in Burke and Linden in 1883. He called upon Beaux Arts architects Jardine, Kent, and Jardine to build his impressive colonial revival retirement home, Birkeland Hall, in 1904 to 1908, and we see that in the upper right. During these same years, Robert Todd Lincoln returned to the site of youthful summer vacations to have Shepley, Rutan, and Coolidge build Hildene in Manchester between 1902 and 1904. The house and grounds, of course, now open to the public. And in 1908, William S. Martin hired architect James T. Kelly and landscaper Arthur Shercliffe, both of Boston, to shape Greatwood Farm in Plainfield, now home to Goddard College, and pictured in the lower right. In all, this movement produced some of Vermont's greatest houses and grandest preserved landscapes. For his project, Edward Everett used a Washington, D.C. architect, George Oakley Totten, Jr., for his house, and the Olmsted firm for his landscape. Totten well fit the mold of the Gilded Age architect. He, too, had been educated at the Ecole des Beaux Arts, in his case between 1893 and 1895, and was well versed in composing grandly in historic vocabularies. Upon his return to this country, he served from 1896 to 98 as chief designer in the office of the supervising architect in the Treasury Department, an operation that essentially acted as architects to the federal government, designing post offices, customs houses, courthouses, and other federal buildings across the country. In 1898, he opened a private practice in Washington and immediately was tapped by ex-Senator John B. Henderson and his wealthy and urbanistically ambitious wife, Mary. The Hendersons had acquired key real estate at the crest of Meridian Hill, directly up 16th Street on axis with the White House. There they had built a brownstone Romanesque revival castle, which we see in the upper left, which Totten expanded and reworked between 1899 and 1907. Mrs. Henderson also enlisted Totten for her ambitious speculative project of developing Meridian Hill as an enclave of embassies and official mansions. There, between 1899 and 1923, he built 9 mansions in a variety of styles, showing off his eclectic talents. The first of these was the so-called Pink Palace at the lower left, built 1905-6 in a Venetian Gothic style and ultimately becoming the home to the Inter-American Defense Board. Then came the French Embassy, now the Embassy of Ghana, built 1907-8 in a Louis XIV style, seen in the upper right, overlooking Meridian Park, and then in the lower center of our slide. The Spanish Embassy was originally offered as a home for the Vice President. It was built in 1921-23 in a stuccoed Hispanic style, and it seems appropriate that ultimately it was the Spanish who bought it. Totten was also involved in the development of another important Washington enclave around Sheridan Circle, building private mansions, many of which ultimately became embassies. The Greek embassy, upper left, was originally built for mining millionaire Hennon Jennings in an Italian Renaissance revival mode in 1906. The Christian Hague residence, upper right, now the Embassy of Cameroon, was treated as a French Renaissance chateau in 1906-7. Also French Renaissance at lower left was the James C. Hu House of 1907. The F.B. Moran residence, subsequently the Embassy of Pakistan, was built in 1909, based on the Chateau of Chantilly. The grandest house on the circle, however, was Everett's, now the Turkish Embassy, built in the same years, 1910-15, as his Vermont project. This is a house with interesting connections. Everett was a friend of Mrs. Henderson. In fact, he met his second wife at one of Mrs. Henderson's teas. He perhaps also came to know his architect through her as well, since she was Totten's great patroness. Given his house's subsequent owners, it's also interesting to note that Totten had worked in Istanbul, designing the first American chancery there and also a mansion for the prime minister. His work so impressed Turkish officialdom that he was offered the post of private architect to the Sultan, but he came back here instead. Hardly Turkish in design, the three-story Everett mansion with its semicircular frontispiece and colossal Corinthian colonnade was inspired by 18th century French chateau and also bears a strong kinship to the south front of the White House. Its complex plan, with functionally interrelated grand public spaces, was adroitly devised on an irregular lot overlooking Rock Creek Park. In it, a marble entry hall led to a grand staircase. We're looking up the staircase. Here's the staircase alcove, and then it splits and rises to an entertainment suite with a grand reception hall, a parlor, dining room, and ballroom, all nicely interconnected there, all with ornamental ceilings and richly carved fireplaces. The lower right is an image of the reception hall. The house, which also boasted an indoor swimming pool and a roof garden overlooking the park, is reputed in the 1930s to have accommodated entertainments for up to 3,000 guests at a time. Okay, Totten's house for the Everetts in Bennington may have been less formal, but was no less grand. It's distinctly different in style, however. A rambling stone mansion set above terraces with spectacular views. In plan, it does have a certain kinship with its Washington cousins in the clever way that Totten utilized towers to link wings and effect changes in their plan direction. This was something he developed in Washington, D.C., largely in response to the city's frequent irregular angled corner building lots. Unlike most of Totten's buildings, which seem to trace their origins from French Renaissance and Baroque, the Bennington house seems more medieval in its sources. Some critics invoke Norman architecture, though the prominent tile roofs are decidedly not Northern European, as anybody who tries to maintain these roofs in a Vermont climate is probably well aware. Totten did use a Romanesque stone vocabulary a few times. Most notably for the Henderson house, we see the castle there in the lower left, and later, when in 1923 he salvaged and rebuilt on a Meridian Hill location adjoining his own house a Henry Hobson Richardson design of 1885 to 8. The Bennington roofs, with their deep splayed eaves and colorful tiles and varied tower caps, however, may have a particular Everett connection. The Everetts also own a neo-Gothic home, the Chateau d'Aille in Vevey, Switzerland, on Lake Geneva, and we see that upper right. While the Bennington house doesn't look much like the chateau, its forms have a strong kinship to other Swiss castles. And its half-timbered, and its half-timbering, its splayed eaves, and its splayed dormers find many counterparts in the Alpine region as well. It's a vocabulary that seems well suited to a hillside mansion overlooking a spectacular verdant mountain landscape, and was adroitly adapted by the multilingual Totten. Not from the Swiss landscape, however, are some of the features of Everett's gardens. The spectacular Great Cascade is reminiscent of Italian 16th and 17th century villas, like the Villa Aldobrandini at Frascati, upper left, the Villa Farnese at Caprarola, lower left, and the Villa Lante at Bagnaia, lower center. Interestingly enough, it is also a motif that was used in 1919 by Mrs. Henderson for the Meridian Hill Park in Washington, which we see in the lower right. The convex concave stair is a motif famously invented by the high Italian Renaissance architect Bramante for the Belvedere courtyard in the Vatican in Rome. It was remodeled out of recognition in the mid-16th century, but by that time it had already been reused for the Farnese Villa at Caprarola, which we see at top left, and continued as an important motif. For instance, we see it in the 19th century Hofburg in Vienna, lower right. I'll leave the details of this estate and its family to my colleagues, but suffice it to say that here we find the historically eclectic tastes and grand design of Gilded Age Washington transported to the Arcadian working estate of a returning Vermont native son. As unusual, indeed foreign as it may appear in its Bennington setting, it's both a mainstream expression of the national tastes of its times and of a significant rural phenomenon within its state.